All right. Good morning, everybody. It is August 11th, 2024. Uh, roughly 3 weeks. No, it is exactly to today, 3 weeks since Joe Biden made the decision to step down and Kamala Harris got the opportunity to step up. So we're in unprecedented times, and I'm joined today on this pod. I like to call it the pod, on this CP3D pod by Dr. Kiana Scott. She runs Kiana Scott Strategies, this awesome consulting firm here in the Pacific Northwest that offers communication and strategy consulting at the intersection of philanthropy, government relations, and public policy. She also teaches at the University of Washington in the Daniel J. Evans School of Public Policy and Governance. And Kiana and I have a long history of working together, and she brings this brilliance around policy, politics, reproductive rights, women, and their navigation of the political space. So, Kiana, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, my pleasure. Great to be here, David. Thanks for having me.
Sure, absolutely. Charles, the C of the CP3, no, not the C of the CP3, Common Power, Douglas Donkey
One of the
Daly.
D's.
One of the D's is in Wisconsin today, and Charles is getting out the vote there and just said, hey, go ahead and go. He's got a complicated schedule today, so he might join us, but maybe not. So we had you on a couple of weeks ago, and we talked about a lot of great things about this powerful campaign that Harris would run for reproductive freedom. And after we were done, you said, hey, we didn't get to a topic we want to make sure we talk about, which is the Supreme Court of the United States. And so I'm just going to leave it to you to open this up, and we're going to go with a deep dive today on how important this election is for the court.
Yeah, we simply cannot overstate how important this election is for the Supreme Court. This is the election that will determine whether the Supreme Court of the United States, the top of the judicial branch, one of our three branches of government, continues or fails and implodes. Everything is at stake in terms of the Supreme Court with this election. I've been thinking about it in three ways. I think about the structure of the Supreme Court. I think about the content of the cases that they're considering. And I think about the ethics or lack thereof and the trust or lack thereof that we're seeing people experience as they think about the Supreme Court. Each of those has the opportunity to undergo a huge and dramatic transformation when President Kamala Harris takes office.
Okay, what are those three again?
President Trump takes office. Content. So what cases are they considering? What rules are they changing? What standing are they setting? Structure of the Supreme Court itself, structure and makeup, let's say. So what does it look like and who is there? Who are those decision makers? And then ethics and trust. How do people in this country feel about the Supreme Court? And how much faith do we have that they are making good ethical decisions?
Okay, great. What a wonderful teacher you are. You're ready to go. You got the three structures. And
it's almost like someone here was instrumental in my education and has taught me everything I know.
I had an advisor in graduate school who would always say, like, I got three things I want to talk about. So then I picked that up and I talk about that, right? And my family, my kids are like, Dad, no, okay, I don't know. But the fact that you just said three things, like, warms my heart.
Yeah.
So I want to get into each of those, but I want to stop for a second and talk about Harris, first of all, and how Kamala Harris, Vice President Kamala Harris, arrives to the court, or how they're going to arrive at this intersection. What can you tell us about Harris and the court generally?
Well, Harris comes from the judicial branch of government. She was a prosecutor. That's how she got her start in politics. She was then elected the state attorney general of California. She was the chief legal officer and the chief law enforcement officer of the largest state in the country. Mm-hmm. So she has engaged with the judicial system extensively prior to getting onto the national scene. And then when she was elected senator of the state of California, she joined the Judiciary Committee, which is one of the committees through which Supreme Court nominees have to make their way as part of their nomination process. And she really leaped onto the national stage in a very, very visible way when she oversaw testimony that Brett Kavanaugh, then a nominee to the Supreme Court, was making. She brought every prosecutorial experience she had, and she just went for it. That was a really powerful moment, arguably one of the first really viral moments of Kamala Harris, national politician. That was long before, well, she was probably thinking about running for president then. It wasn't quite where the country was, but that moment really catapulted her into national awareness.
Yeah, was that 2018, 2019? What was it?
That was 2018, I want to say, but don't quote me
Okay,
on that. Around in
sure.
there.
Yeah, no, I think it was 2018 because I believe that Susan Collins voted for Kavanaugh, and I was doing a talk at Starbucks that day.
Mm-hmm.
And right in the middle of my talk, somebody like in the audience just kind of like, oh, did this. And they're like, I'm like, well, what was that? And they're like,
Yeah.
Collins just announced that she's voting for Kavanaugh.
Yeah.
Okay.
I have a really clear memory. I now work for myself, but at that point I was working with a team in an office, and we all gathered around someone's computer and watched the testimony live. And it was this really, now we don't have a lot of moments like that, but it was a moment that we all wanted to be engaged with at the same time.
Yeah, and I want to show. I'm glad you bring this up. I want to show a clip that is Kamala Harris as senator from California. It's just one very quick clip of
Mm-hmm.
her asking Brett Kavanaugh a question that really seems to speak to her campaign today. All
Mm-hmm.
right. It wasn't just a question that today has no relevance. It's a question that seems to be central to to what she's running her presidential campaign on. So here it is, Senator Harris and judicial nominee Kavanaugh at the time.
Can you think of any laws that give government the power to make decisions about the male body?
I'm happy to answer a more specific question, but
Male versus female?
there are medical procedures.
Okay. That the government has the power to make a decision about a man's body?
I thought you were asking about medical procedures that
No,
are unique to men.
I'll repeat the question. Can you think of any laws that give the government the power to make decisions about the male body?
I'm not thinking of any right now, Senator.
Not thinking about any of them right there. No, because there aren't any. Right.
Nope. And obviously she knew that going in.
Right.
That's the point of that question, is to highlight the vast discrepancy in our country, but that speaks to her ability to go after people, to approach them with an argument in mind. She's building out an argument here.
Right. That's the language. That's where prosecute becomes a verb. To prosecute, a good lawyer doesn't ask the question unless they know what the answer is going to be. So she comes from this background and does seem to have thrived in these spaces where it's direct kind of question and answer and very precise knowledge bases. So as you think about her transitioning to become, as she is now, officially going to be the nominee for the Democrats, just quick aside, we're doing a Common Power 4 days of programming around the convention. Okay. So next, this is Sunday, starting on the 19th, next 8 days from now, Monday through Thursday, we'll be doing, I think, 4 hours for each night with the speeches wrapped into the middle of those. So we'll invite you back for that, of course, Kiana. Hopefully you can join us for that. But as she builds her campaign, what is she saying about the court right now? What is she saying about the court?
Well, she and Joe Biden are together because she's also vice president of the United States still. She's wearing 2 hats, working 2 jobs, right?
Pretty normal there, right?
Pretty normal there. She and Joe Biden are saying that the court is not functional right now, that the court has lost the trust of the American people, and that there need to be significant changes. And Joe Biden has suggested a couple sweeping changes. Probably won't pass pass Congress, but he is standing up and saying we need to instate term limits. We need to.
So this is the structure. This is the structure space, right?
It's a specific argument about the structure space, but it's a larger recognition that that this is deeply flawed right now.
Okay.
That the Supreme Court, as it currently stands, is not working. and it's not working for anyone. The Supreme Court is one of the least popular entities in the United States right now. Pretty hard to do because a lot of our entities aren't very popular right now. But we've just seen over the last 10 years, certainly over the last 20 years, a real just implosion, landslide. I can't even think of the right word. It's so dramatic, but just a huge loss of trust in this institution in direct response to actions that many people see as not in keeping with the gravity of this branch of government and the important role that it plays in our country and in our political system.
Oh, so what's she saying? What are they saying?
So they're saying that we need to change it, that we need to reform the court, that we need to change it significantly. And I think Kamala Harris is well positioned to make that argument as an attorney, as someone who has significant legal background in a couple of different ways, who, to my knowledge, has never worked directly with the Supreme Court other than engaging in testimony as Supreme Court nominees came through the Judiciary Committee. But she knows what she's talking about. She's able to make this argument really, really clearly and really cogently, and to bring it to the national stage in a way that just a couple of years ago, we weren't talking about the Supreme Court during presidential elections in the way that we have the last few cycles. That's a relatively, I don't have any evidence to back this up, but it feels like it's a relatively new phenomenon that considerations of the Supreme Court are taking center stage in the way that they are these days.
Sure. So much
Would
so
you
that
agree with that?
I absolutely think that it should have been more central to the discussion in 2016, and it would have made a difference in that election. I think Trump, of course, gets to appoint 3 Supreme Court justices in 4 years, which has given us this 6-3 conservative court, his handpicked court, which is now giving presidential immunity, like giving presidents his immunities, wiped out the Dobbs decision, right? Overturned the Chevron decision. I mean, just all kinds of horrible stuff. So you said, I heard 3 areas: content of what the court takes up, structure of the court, and the ethics of the court. I know that Harris and Biden have specifically rolled out some ideas around structure and ethics. So let's start there and then end with content. Okay. So what are they saying right now about structure and ethics as potential reforms that she would be as part of the campaign she's running on?
Around structure, a big piece is term limits. Right now, members of the Supreme Court, justices of the Supreme Court, are lifetime appointments. And there is, we'll talk more about ethics in just a minute, but once you are there, you are there. And that has some really, really long-term impacts just in tenure, in ability of justices to make decisions, knowing there's that no one else is able to step in. It's encouraging presidents to appoint younger and younger justices so that they can retain ideology on the court as long as possible. We saw that a lot with Brett Kavanaugh. We've seen that with Justice Amy Coney Barrett. We've certainly seen that with Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. Like, people are getting appointed at a younger and younger age to gain longevity of a specific ideology on the court and to sort of game the system. It's also encouraging justices to potentially stick around longer than they would have to if they were term limited, but it removes incentive to step down earlier than you might otherwise.
So the positive side of lifetime appointments is this idea that they would be not beholden to the political kind of currents of the day, right? That's the positive notion. And this is written into the Constitution. Is this written into the Constitution, lifetime term limits?
That's a great question. I don't know off the top of my head.
I don't think it is. I think it's pretty vague.
It turns out a lot of the Supreme Court, a lot of what goes into the Constitution about the Supreme Court is pretty vague. A lot of what we understand the Supreme Court to be today is based on precedents. It's based on sort of longevity within our system. It's not based on the text of the Constitution.
Right. Okay. So the idea that they would not be beholden to the politics of the day. Okay, that's a great thing. The reality is it also gives them immunity completely from any concern at all about the general public, right? Complete lack of concern about the general public. And the court itself one of the things that they've said is that there's 9 justices right now. The Biden and Harris, and presumably Harris, are opening up the can of possibly expanding the court. Now, I do believe that it has been historical precedent that there's been one Supreme Court justice for each circuit court in this country, right? Or district courts. And there's 13 of those currently, right? So we're at 9. So at least on precedent, which I know this originalist court loves, is not precedent, but tradition. They love tradition. There would seem to be a good argument for at least expanding the court by 4 seats.
Well, they also love restricting rights. So, you know, they're going to have to pick which side of that argument they want to fall on. I have a hard time imagining that they would say, yes, let's actually become a more democratic institution. But you're exactly right. There's a really compelling argument to be made from a traditionalist perspective that there should be 13 justices on the Supreme Court.
So term limits and possibly expansion of the court, those are 2 structural possibilities, right?
Yep, 2 significant structural possibilities.
That starts from a position of like, that seems kind of crazy, but actually isn't. It's just a set of ideas that need more discussion that we get more comfortable with, right? Okay. And I would love to have term limits for all federal justices.
I think it's a great idea. I think term limits are one of the most important tools of effective governance across institutions. We have term limits in the presidency for just this reason. We have term limits in most gubernatorial mansions across the country for just this reason. It's a really important way of making sure that decision makers in key leadership roles are responsive to the people of the country or the state, the people they serve.
Okay. Now, what about the ethics? Because it does seem that there are a few judges on the Supreme Court that have not necessarily abided by certain kind of regular code of ethics that a judge should have.
Yeah, well, it turns out that the Supreme Court is responsible for upholding its own ethical standards. And when you want to accept millions and millions and millions of dollars in luxury vacations and private jet flights and boat trips, it's pretty easy to say, we don't need to focus on the ethics right now. I'm going on vacation. And we, of course, know that this is what's been happening with at least some of the justices. So there's a lack of incentive for them to do this work that they need to do, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many people, to actually uphold an ethical institution at the Supreme Court. They have no exterior incentive to do this if they don't want to. We also know that there are justices who believe firmly that there should be strong ethics. Elena Kagan has called for ethics review within the Supreme Court, holding themselves to a high and shared standard. So I think there's a lot of recognition that this is a problem and that this is impacting the public perception of what they do and how they do it. But it's up to them. And one of Biden's recommendations is that this change, that there be an ethics standard for the Supreme Court, the way there is, it's worth saying again, for almost every other political institution across the United States. And let's not be fools. The Supreme Court is an inherently political institution. It deals with politics. It deals with power. It takes partisan work to get people into those roles. It's a political institution. It should be held to the same standard as other political institutions.
So when Justice Thomas takes trips from Harlan Crow and others, and then either whether he discloses them or doesn't disclose them, and he often doesn't, you're saying that currently there's no mechanism to kind of like police that.
There's public opinion, but he has a lifetime appointment, so it doesn't matter. It does not matter for him. And this is where that structure and that ethics piece really are just intertwined completely, because you can't, it is almost impossible to change the ethics piece without also changing the structural piece, at least a bit. Those are really closely connected. And right now we're seeing them both really struggle.
Okay. This is a chart of gifts to the Supreme Court that have been made to justices in the last 20 years. And this is in the, dollars is on the Y column, the Y axis going up. And we see that that this is just disclosed. It includes both disclosed and undisclosed. And this is previous to some recent non-disclosures that have been revealed by Clarence
So this is
Thomas.
just what we're aware of. There could
Exactly.
be a lot more.
Yes. But Thomas and then Scalia and Alito are these three outliers. With Thomas, it's just like a different kind of universe. He's in a different
They clearly had to
galaxy.
change the scale on this chart to accommodate.
Right. It was probably in like the hundreds of thousands before that, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that truth that there are no ethics governing these courts, the Supreme Court, means that Thomas can rule and Alito can rule on a January 6th case, even though they're married to people who have very clear, strong viewpoints, let alone themselves.
Not
Okay?
only they can, but they are. And they
Uh-huh.
are facing rebuttal with absolute nonchalance because there is nothing anyone can do about it. The president cannot remove them from office. Congress cannot remove them from office. Like they are there. It is a lifetime appointment. They have no incentive not to make these decisions that they're making. There's no one holding their feet to the fire.
Yeah, Neil Gorsuch just recently said, right, to Biden and Harris as they offered these proposed adjustments, like they better be careful, right? He said something like that in those words, which is a classic kind of intimidation line, right? Like you better be careful because your case might come before the Supreme Court at some point.
Yeah, because obviously these two branches of the federal government work together really closely. The Biden administration, the soon-to-be Harris administration, will bring cases before the Supreme Court all the time. There is also a not insignificant chance that there will be cases around the coming election on which the Supreme Court will have to rule. And that is something that keeps me up at night, I'll tell you. But Neil Gorsuch was not being subtle in saying, we have authority over you. We know it. We're not afraid to wield it to political purpose.
Yeah.
That's a pretty powerful thing to hear from the Supreme Court of the United States.
Yeah. So in this election, well, we'll finish the podcast today by talking about the justices on the court and what kind of openings might occur in the next couple of years. But let's go to the third area that you've mentioned, the content of the rulings. And what are you talking about here?
Well, over the last couple of years, we have seen a number of rulings and we've always seen rulings with significant national impact. That's the role of the Supreme Court of the United States. It's to consider cases with national impact that have come up through other channels of the judicial system. But we have seen rulings that have grabbed the nation and just taken the nation by storm. The Dobbs case overturning Roe v. Wade is, of course, a huge one. That's one that I think of the most when thinking about this. Also thinking back to Citizens United, which allowed money to sort of sweep into the electoral system and be unchecked, had significant difference. Most recently, the presidential and vice presidential immunity ruling that the Supreme Court decided on just a couple of weeks back has huge national impact for a case against Donald Trump that's moving forward through the courts right now. We are just seeing a lot of cases that are making it clear, not all that I just mentioned, but certainly that last one, that make it clear that the court is deeply partisan and is deeply committed to not only one political party, but furthering the career of one particular person.
I would say a very specific view of what democracy is or isn't. They also wiped out crucial sections of the Voting Rights Act in several court decisions, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I completely agree with the way you just said that, David. And I would also add, and who democracy serves.
Okay.
Because I don't think they believe that it should work for everyone. And that's what we're seeing with these rulings that they're bringing out. The Supreme Court is always their rulings are always going to make someone mad because they are making a decision. There are people on either side of that. But what we are seeing is a huge outswell of mistrust in the court based on these decisions. And that has a huge impact for the organization and the institution moving forward. So we're seeing just an incredible amount of attention. We're seeing Donald Trump promise that he will wield the power of the court in specific ways to limit, restrict, or remove rights from people. He is threatening, he is making threats using the Supreme Court as a tool. Biden, when he came into office, also made promises about what he would do with the Supreme Court, who he would appoint. Kamala Harris hasn't talked about her appointment specifically that I've heard, although I'm sure she will very shortly if she hasn't already. But that's a really common piece of presidential campaigns at this point. You talk about what you would do with an open appointment on the Supreme Court, and we'll likely have the chance to move some things around there. But Donald Trump is very explicitly using the Supreme Court and the partisan imbalance that he has created there with the Supreme Court as a threat.
Yeah.
That's pretty scary.
So the court is 6-3 conservative and very strongly conservative, not just modestly conservative, but very strongly conservative.
Yeah, it turns out that Chief Justice John Roberts is now like a moderate on the court, which
exactly.
is sort of unbelievable.
Exactly, right. Roberts has been exactly. So when you look at history of how many justices a president gets to appoint, Biden's got 1, Trump had 3. Okay. It's often 1 to 2, okay, for a 4-year window. That has to do with the political strategy is clear of justices. It's clear that Anthony Kennedy retired during the Trump presidency intentionally so that Trump could appoint somebody. It's also tied to the ages of the people on the court. So right now, the 2 oldest justices are Thomas at 76 years old and Alito at 74 years old.
And I want to interrupt. I'm sorry there, David, but just to say, Trump also had an extra appointment because of the political machinations of Mitch McConnell. When Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away, that was months and months and months before the presidential election. That should have been an Obama appointment without a problem. And Mitch McConnell held it up so that it would not be an Obama appointment for months, and then reversed that process when Amy Coney Barrett was appointed at the very end in truly the last days of Trump's presidency. So he played both sides of that there. So there's a hugely political element here as well that Congress can play a role in.
Right. That decision by McConnell to not appoint a seat after Scalia passed away is one of the most defining impacts upon the court in our lifetime. So if we look at if Harris gets elected or Trump gets elected, is there a decent chance? Let me say this and you tell me if you agree. If Trump gets elected, he will get 2 appointments because Alito and Thomas will retire. Because they will give Trump that chance to appoint them, to replace them. If Harris gets appointed, then she will probably get Sotomayor's seat, okay, who's 70 years old. And she'll probably retire in that window. But the other possibilities that she might get would be on the conservative side, okay, Thomas and Alito. They would undoubtedly try very hard not to be replaced in that window. But if Harris gets elected for 4, let alone 8 years, let's say she gets 8 years, all right? That is how liberals get a chance back on the court, right? Is for at least 4, preferably 8 more years, 8 years of Harris.
Absolutely. Not only do they get a chance, do they get their foot in the door, but then they really have the possibility of changing the structure of the Supreme Court not so that it serves liberals, but so that people are not locked out of it in the way that they have been for the past couple of decades. So this could be, and I very much hope is, a fundamental shift in how the Supreme Court functions in American society and American government.
Yeah, it seems to me that we need 2 major structural adjustments at the national political level. The first is the court, and we're talking about that today. And I'm learning some chunks from you. And then we need to get rid of the filibuster in the
Absolutely.
Senate.
Yep.
Okay?
Those are 2 giant roadblocks to either effective legislation or enacting legislation that are significantly impacting progress in this country and progressive policies being passed. Yeah.
And the Senate is for both of those is the essential place because they make the decisions about themselves. That's a majority vote to change the filibuster in the Senate, which I think will get done when the Democrats hold the majority by the narrowest of margins this time. And they also approve the Supreme Court justices and make decisions about what it goes on in the court. They're probably the place that could make the adjustments that you're talking about, the ethics reforms adjustments.
Yeah, the road to the Supreme Court goes through the US Senate, and that's a huge reason that I know you and the Common Power folks are focusing so much attention, not just on the Senate, but on key states that hold our ability to keep or even eke out a narrow gain in the Democratic majority in the Senate.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's finish with back to Harris and her kind of philosophy and her statements about what's important to her as a candidate, as a human, as a political leader. Over my shoulder is the Kamala Harris campaign slogan sign from 2019 and 2020 when she ran for office. And it says Kamala Harris for the people, right? And that for the people is the phrase that a prosecutor stands up and says when they start to their case, right?
It's how she identified herself every time she walked into the courtroom as a prosecutor. Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Kamala Harris for the people. All right. What do you think, like that terminology for the people as a frame, as a kind of like a bucket, a way of thinking about the world, means that we get when Kamala Harris is elected president?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is such an interesting communication question because this was not only something she said throughout the early part of her career, this was her slogan when she ran for president
Right.
first time. And it's not her slogan now because she gets to bring this piece of her identity with her. She doesn't need to talk about it in quite the same way. She now just is Harris for president.
Yeah.
But we know that that piece is there. She's being very, very clear in this messaging, in the key piece of her biography and identity that is wrapped up in this phase of her life, in her selection of Walz as her running mate, in every approach she's bringing to the presidential campaign to say, I'm working on behalf of the American people. I am not working to enrich myself, my family, Clarence Thomas, or a small select few. I'm interested in policies that impact everyone and that are specifically targeted in many cases to people who've been historically excluded and marginalized. That's pretty powerful. She's making that clear, and she has been making that clear through her career. That is also, she's running as a Democrat. She is a Democrat. That's usually the bent of the Democratic candidate, but she's really embracing it and leaning into it. I would expect to see a lot more of that theme emerge over the 4 days of the convention coming up.
Freedom seems to be the message of the campaign, right?
Well, if you have a Beyonce song that's that good, you gotta pull it in. Absolutely.
Right. There are the rumors, and I'm waiting to see them for Beyonce to perform at the Democratic National Convention, right?
It would be great.
Sing that song as Harris comes out.
Yeah.
So freedom is the greatest thing in my kind of like political scholar journey, to see the Democrats seizing freedom, the mantle of freedom, and taking it as the higher moral position. And Walz gives it this very colloquial voice with his phraseology of mind your own damn business. Okay. And Harris gives it the much more polished, lawyerly kind of legal philosophy of rights and protections and autonomy. And so that language of freedom to me is a very, very important political shift that has occurred, that Trump and Vance have, and the Republicans and the Supreme Court have led the Republicans to give up. They've given it up. Okay. And the Democrats, with Josh Shapiro and others kind of leading the way on some of this messaging, have seized it. And to me, it is a very, very important political move that has legal implications.
I think you're exactly right. And Democrats have made this amazing narrative shift where they've taken this Republican concept of freedom. Republicans really did own that messaging. And they've said, we are about an expansive freedom. We are a freedom that brings people in, that opens doors, that creates opportunity. Republicans were really clear. They had a very narrow, restrictive view of what freedom meant and who it was for.
Uh-huh.
I've seen so many tweets and memes the last couple of weeks saying things like, I don't know what to do with myself. It feels like the Democrats are making good choices. But I'm so proud of us as a party for really saying, yeah, we are going to claim this concept. This is central to who we are as a political group, what we believe, what our policy priorities are, and what we stand for. I think they're doing a really good job of shifting that frame and claiming it. And a key corollary to that is this idea of joy and being a joyful warrior that I think Harris and Walz are together spinning up so effectively. Freedom can be fun. Freedom
Yeah.
doesn't need to be this scary thing, you're in the trenches for. It doesn't need to be about fighting. It can be about gaining. It can be about welcoming. It can be about celebrating. That's really exciting. And I think that feels really good for a lot of people.
Yeah, I totally agree. Totally agree. This is good stuff for us to come back to over the course of time. I want to talk tomorrow. I'm going to talk in the podcast about patriotism, about this, because that's a piece of the Harris-Walz messaging too. But I want to end with you saying, telling us and all the folks who listen to this at Common Power, when Harris is elected president of the United States, that you believe X will happen with the Supreme Court in her 4 or 8 years. You believe X, and what's your X and your Y? You believe X and Y will happen in a Harris presidency with the Supreme Court.
That's a great question. I believe that President Kamala Harris will. The easy answer is appoint 2 justices. The broader answer is, I think she expands the court. I think she appoints more than 2 justices.
Wow.
I don't know that we get all the way to 13, but I think she expands the court. I think she has an opportunity to appoint more than 2 justices, 2 replacements, and 2 new justices.
That's so exciting. And I just don't see Biden would never do that. Okay.
No, I think it's very telling that Biden made these recommendations about the Supreme Court after he is a lame duck. He's not.
Okay.
He is now, this is a communication exercise for him. It is a political exercise for Kamala Harris, but it's a communication exercise for him. He didn't say that when he was running for president.
Yeah.
That could have fired up some people in his base. He didn't say it, didn't do it, didn't make that move.
Yeah. And Harris she understands the stakes of reproductive autonomy in a way that Biden intellectually gets, but Harris gets it at this fundamental level that without adjustments to the Supreme Court, you can't change right now. Okay.
I think she has a very clear perspective on what reproductive justice means for the country as policy, but also politically in a way that Biden just couldn't wrap his head around, and wasn't comfortable wrapping his head around, and wasn't potentially the right person to wrap his head around it. She gets it. I think she sees the writing on the wall in terms of how people perceive the Supreme Court, the lack of trust, the lack of accountability that exists within the Supreme Court. She understands how to take all of that and use it to her political benefit. That makes her sound more conniving than I think she is. I think she's a politician running for office who sees where the electorate's energy is.
Yeah.
And it has been around reproductive justice in the Supreme Court because, again, many people don't like seeing a bunch of male justices writing rules like this.
Sure. Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Kiana Scott. Created Kiana Scott Strategies. Let me just say, as Common Power, who's hired her for some work, she's doing great work. And we'll bring you back again really soon. Thank you. And thank you for adjusting some things personally to make this work
Yeah.
today too.
Totally. Great to be here. Thanks for having me, David.
Okay. See ya.
Take care.